So here at Crown Country Park, which is an embryo syndicate in the Peterborough area. Now it's a really deep clay pit this, quite an interesting lake, and I've actually been catching quite a few over the last few weeks. So the most important thing in the winter, as at any other time of the year, is location. So the first night I did on this lake, which was at the start of November, I fished in a swim down the bottom end, which gave me a really good view of the lake, as I wanted to sort of see and hear where the fish were holding up. As it transpired, I was at the completely wrong end of the lake, and I ended up seeing them more up this end, out towards the middle. So I made a move, came up here and fished long out to the middle to where I was seeing them show. I was hearing a lot in the nights as well. You know, that's a big edge at this time of year. Stay up as much as you can through the hours of darkness, because there's a lot more going on throughout the hours of darkness in the winter months. So the key at this time of the year, as it is at any time of the year, is location. So when I did my first night on here at the beginning of November, I set up in a swim down the bottom end of the lake that gave me a really good view of all the open water. The reason for that being, I wanted to be able to hear or potentially see where the fish were showing and hopefully locate where they were held up. Now, as it transpired, I was at the completely wrong end of the lake. I did hear a couple that night and I did see a few the following morning, and they were out in the middle in front of where I am now. Now, as I've mentioned before, this is an incredibly deep lake. In fact, out there in the middle, it's around 35, 36 foot. Now, I know that because there's a depth map available for all online that you can see, and it shows you the depths of the lake. But that's where the fish were held up. They were out in the middle over that deep water. So I came in here and I fished out long towards where I'd seen them. And that night I actually caught two, which was a really good start. So after doing that first night in here and catching those two, it became quite apparent there was a lot of fish out here. So what I did at the end of that trip, I decided to bait, and I baited quite heavily. And the baiting has really been the key to the success that I've had over the last few weeks. Now, the bait I've been putting out there, it's not just any old bait. You know, the main factors with bait at this time of the year is they need to be highly digestible, low in saturated fats, and in this case, very visual. There's a lot of depth out there and I want the fish to be able to see it. It's got to be high in attraction. And I've also kept it quite large items of bait, i.e. whole boilies, sweet corn and quite large pellets. The reason for that being, it's very deep, they get a lot of undertow, especially when the wind picks up. And I want to ensure that that bait is sinking where the spawn lands as such. I don't want too much of a spread. I've put a small amount of crumb in just to add to the attraction, but not a lot. As I say, most of the baits I've put out there are large items of bait. I've also been coating my baits in plenty of smart liquid, which adds loads of extra attraction. So the amount of bait that I use in the winter is important, as the last thing you want to do is overdo it. So to begin with, I went in with around about 20 spoms, which is still a fair amount of bait, but not too much. And as I say, that night I caught two, and it was apparent that there was a lot of carp out there. So I decided to bait the spot quite heavily. In fact, I baited it at the end of that trip with a full 17-litre bucket. Now that sounds like quite a lot of bait, but I was leaving for the lake for sort of 5-6 days, and as I've mentioned before, it was apparent that there was quite a lot of fish out there. So when I came back the following week, I dropped back in here, got the rods out on the baited zone, and again just put 20 spoms out there. Now, as it transpires, I actually caught the first carp that trip within a couple of hours getting the rods out. So it was obvious to me that they'd been out there, and most of that bait, if not all of that bait I'd put out the week before, plus the 20 spoms I'd just put out, they'd probably eaten it. So after that, I baited with about 5 or 6 spoms per fish, just to keep a bit of bait going out there and keep them feeding. Now, it's important to judge the amount of bait you're putting in by how the fish are reacting to it. As I said before, within a couple of hours of putting the bait in, I'd caught a fish, so it was apparent that they were out there and they were happy to eat it. Now, it's important to adjust the quantity of bait you're putting in depending on how your session's panning out. If I wasn't catching them, I wouldn't have put so much in. Now, at the end of that session, I repeated the process again. I baited with another bucket of bait in preparation for the following week's session. Now, the spot I've been fishing is 31 wraps, which is obviously quite a long way out there, so I want to make my life as easy as possible. So the line I've been using is the 15-pound tapered lung chuck, and even in the windy conditions like we've got today, I've had no issues whatsoever with reaching the required range. Now, the rig I've been using is a simple spinner rig with a 4.5-inch boom tied out a 50-pound XT snag leader. I've got a size 4 curve on the end, and it's fished on 3-footer lead core, helicopter style, with a 4-ounce lead on the end to get the required range. Now, as for hook baits, I'm using a small yellow pop-up, as it's bright, it's visual, and it complements the corn I'm putting out quite nicely. Now it's important to wear appropriate clothing in the winter, as if you're not warm, you're not going to be fishing effectively. So you want some warm, dry boots, a nice pair of thick woolen socks, a thermal base layer, nice warm jumper, thick padded coat over the top, nice pair of thick warm trousers, perhaps a gaiter, as on windy days like today it stops the draft down your neck, and a nice warm hat to keep your head warm. So if you follow these simple steps and you get your location right, get your bait right, wear the appropriate clothing, winter fishing can not only be productive, it can also be enjoyable and comfortable.